Good morning, everybody. You're very welcome to this week's episode of Inclusion Dialogue. And I'm deeply honoured this week because I'm speaking with somebody who I have been very much excited to talk to for some time since the podcast began. Alfredo Artiles, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, sharing your thoughts, and giving us some of your extensive insights into inclusive education. Um, I start off a lot of these podcasts, Alfredo, if you have listened to them, asking my guests. It's just, I suppose, an area of interest that I have is how did you end up working in this field? What motivated you to get into this and to explore so extensively this area of work? So, can I start the interview by asking you just that?
Of course, yes. Thank you so much again, John, for this invitation. I'm excited to be part of this growing community, and I commend you for this work. I think it's important to advance global dialogues about this very important topic. Um, I mentioned to you before we started the recording that this first question is very critical for the work that we do in the academy, mainly because every single scholar in the world is doing their scholarship because of some biographical connection, one way or another. Sometimes it's direct, sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's unconscious. And so I think it's important to contextualize the work that we do. And in my case, I started my work as a professional in the global south. I worked in the 80s, 1980s, in Central America, specifically in Guatemala, starting as a special education teacher, eventually moved to um, be an administrator in a school. This was a special education school, so it was a segregated school. That was the model used in the country. There was no legislation protecting the rights of individuals with disabilities or special needs. And as a result of that, I worked very hard to begin to branch out into local ordinary schools to have our students um, join those educational communities. And it was an incredibly emotional political process for me to persuade principals that these were not kids that were going to be ruining their lives. They were not dangerous. They were learners like all of the rest of the students in this. And so I learned a great deal from doing that kind of um, policy on the ground kind of work to open doors and opportunities for students, mostly with learning and behavioral needs at the time. However, I became increasingly frustrated that all of the tools that we had available to serve kids who were mostly from low income backgrounds and many of them from indigenous backgrounds in Guatemala City. This is a country with half of the population coming from indigenous backgrounds, about half of the population living in poverty, huge needs and demands, as well as incredible cultural diversity. I became increasingly concerned because the tools, the curriculum, the pedagogies available did not speak at all to the realities and the needs of the communities we were serving. It was mostly information from Western Europe and the US. And so I thought naively that if I became a researcher, I will generate the knowledge that we needed. And so I pursued graduate degrees. But in the meantime, before I went to get my graduate degrees in the US, um, I was involved in capacity building efforts with the Ministry of Education at the national level, doing different things, as well as engage in teacher education at a local university, Catholic university. I grew up in Catholic education, so I had this deep, ingrained commitment to social justice that I learned through my family and my education. And this was critical because I saw everything through that lens. And so inclusive education was just the way I saw the world, that it was needed at the time. So I pursued that. And when I arrived to my programs, graduate programs, again, I saw the gaps in what we were discussing and reading and studying in the university and what I was seeing in local schools, where I saw a lot of black and brown students placed in these programs, and there was no attention to culture, language, race, or any inequality beyond disability ability differences. And so that silence in the literature, in the climate of the programs, really triggered me to begin to pay attention to this in a more systematic way. And I started to do that from an early time in my career. And here I am, 32 years later, of doing this work as an academic. But that's, in a brief way, the trajectory
Yeah.
I followed.
That's fascinating. And I love to hear your stories of I suppose, that policy on the ground piece, because in many ways, in the Irish context, you hear about that a lot. And, you mentioned there about speaking with principals and trying to maybe convince them of the benefits or the merits of kind of breaking down the two different settings.
Right.
What do you think worked there if you were to just reflect back on that time? What was it a challenging task to try and convince the minds of school leaders in that way?
It was a mixed bag. We were successful in a number of cases. I will say more about that when we discuss issues in the global south based on
Sure.
the research we've done. But um, what I found was that leaders, either in the policy domain in the ministry or in local schools, really didn't have a framework or a language to make sense of this diversity in the student population. They had this exoticizing approach to think about students with special needs, and they thought that they should be relegated to be served by people who had hyper specializations, and that was not the job of the main educational system.
Yeah.
And so this lack of a language and a vision was a major obstacle. And the approach I took was to build relationships over time with these leaders, to get to know each other, to trust us, to say, we're going to be working with you in partnership. I'm not going to be dropping kids and leave, and you will never see us. And so we had to reconfigure and reimagine the approach in our school that was mostly based on a charity model to raise money for these poor kids, and begin to think, how do we begin to branch out and become embedded in the mainstream educational system at the time.
Yeah.
A few years later, they've developed a whole framework in Guatemala to serve the needs of these kids. But at
Wow.
the time, it was the Wild West. It was
Yeah.
really no support for any kinds of gestures or changes at the time. There were people committed to equity and diversity at the time, and we were able to place some of these students. But the scale of this, I mean, we had very few students, about 150 in the school. I mean, this talking about scale, it was
Mm,
minimal.
mm, yes. Moving then on to, you sent me some wonderful pieces of research during the week, Alfredo, and in one of them in particular, I just thought there was a lovely passage about the evolution of inclusive education globally and over time, and you bring into that, as you mentioned just now, the kind of evolution within the global north and the global south. Could you flesh that out for listeners? What can maybe describe firstly the evolution of inclusive education at a global level, separating it into these two areas?
Yes, and there is a risk in this discussion of the global north and the south to end up in this binary, which is an illusion. There are many global south in the global north,
Mm,
and vice versa,
yeah.
and so they are interdependent and they are mutually influential. So I want to make sure that we explain that this is not this us and them kind of
Yeah.
discussion, that they are very much intertwined. When we see that history, uh, it's interesting that we trace the origins of inclusive education to certain agreements, political agreements, and not surprisingly, we attribute that to the West and Western
Yeah.
nations, Salamanca, Western Europe, the US, when in reality, there have been major efforts for inclusion in the global South for centuries. And so we have to keep that in mind, that there is this colonial disposition we bring to understand the trajectory of inclusion, as if the magnanimous gesture of the West really offer us this beautiful idea. That is
Yeah.
not the case.
Mm,
But nevertheless, if we think about the origins of inclusive education, it started with this political commitment. It had this really ambitious um, agenda to be truly inclusive, to think about difference in a way that covered the different forms and formations that we have developed in educational systems to designate people as the other by virtue of a number of indicators: ability, class, gender, language, national origin, etc., etc. And so it was a huge aspiration. And over time, as we know, we see the research done around inclusive education, particularly in the US and in many Western European nations. The focus narrowed significantly around students with disabilities. And so in many contexts, inclusive education became the new special education, which is antithetical to the original intent of inclusive education. Inclusive education uh, aspired to reconfigure and reimagine educational systems to be uh, welcoming to multiple forms of difference and to be responsive to those. And then it became a site, a place, and it became an agenda of moving kids from this place to this other place. And so in that way, we lost a lot conceptually and practically. In addition to that, the literature has been vague conceptually. There are multiple definitions of inclusive education. There are there is literature showing that there are multiple discourses that engage the idea of inclusive education. Some speak to the need to have, and there is a lot of debate and argument that we saw in the 90s about this. Do we really need this? Is this needed? Are we ready for this? Do teachers want this? Do parents want it? And so there are multiple engagements with this idea. And over time, we see how systems evolve in their approach in addressing some of those discourses. What is fascinating is to analyze how each national context is framing this idea of difference. Is it only about ability differences? There is some variability, even within the European continent, about how disability is defined. Do we cater to the needs of certain groups of students that are considered to have different ability levels by having to diagnose and to define those? Well, some countries have opted not to do that necessarily. Portugal, for example, some experience in the Scandinavian countries speak to some of this, whereas the US is incredibly siloed and categorical in defining disability categories as a way to ensure rights for individuals and access to these resources. I think we haven't done enough sociological and anthropological analysis in each of these permutations of inclusive education to understand what are the consequences in terms of, excuse me, framing differences and ideas of inclusion in these alternative ways. Uh, who benefits? What are the consequences of these decisions? What is the long term evolution of these investments in education for these groups? And so I think it's critical that we keep that in mind. We have seen more recently a movement from the global north into the global south over the last couple of decades, most intensely. And there are some troubling trends. For example, my colleague Maya Kalianpour just published a book a year or two ago about the implementation of the category learning disabilities in India. And it was an almost direct transplant of the definition from the US into the Indian context, and how, of course, a whole testing industry is flourishing, and how conceptions, assumptions, and practices from the US that really, by the way, have not worked very well are being now applied in the Indian context. And so it's an important study documenting what happens when this concept travels across national borders without attention to history and culture and local context. Um, and so I think there is this caveat that we need to imagine a world in which we can benefit from what each community is learning to transfer ideas and experiences, but without being thoughtful regarding the way you are supposed to adapt and situate and honor local histories and traditions. It will be a disaster in the end. But in general, I think I will summarize it along those lines. There are many things that I can expand on, but let me pause here and see if you have any follow ups.
I do. And it's about, yeah, I'd like you to describe a little bit more about the consequences because, again, I'm coming from the Irish system. We have most of our emphasis has gone on the inputs, the supports, and, basically how we can best serve this group. Albeit in a segregated setting, increasingly so. Actually, we're expanding our special education system here in Ireland at present. Can you talk about the kind of consequences and often unintended consequences of policy decisions that affect system change and school level change, obviously, as well, in terms of allocation and placement?
Yeah. Um, That's a $1 billion question that we haven't asked enough, I think, at least in the US. There is a major debate going on in the United States about the racialization of disability for about 50 to 53 years now. Major debate in the research community. For many years, it was documented that certain groups, particularly African American and Latinx communities, tend to be over identified. In the last 10, 12 years, there has been some studies released showing that that is not the case. That if you bring a certain set of methodological approaches, what you end up documenting is that these groups are indeed under identified. And then from there, the argument has proceeded to say this is wrong because then, and they've resorted to this deficit approach that has pervaded a lot of the work done in this domain by saying, given the fact that there is a prevalence, such a high prevalence of poverty among these communities, Black and Brown communities, it is only understandable that they have a greater rate of need, and therefore they may need additional extra supports in the form of specialized or inclusive models. And so it's a way of perpetuating the assumptions we make about certain communities. That doesn't mean that disability doesn't exist or is not present in Black and Brown communities. The question is, how are we making sense of performance in schools in contexts in which the norms we've used may not necessarily apply equally to all the groups represented in the system? Can we think about that normative dimension that may be a little more permeable and receptive to acknowledge that there is not only one way of thinking or solving problems that may punish you when you take a certain test that will result in a diagnosis? And so the problem is that the debate has been restricted to whether the pattern is over or under identification, and whether we are being not accurate enough in diagnosing disabilities. And what has been left out is your question: what are the consequences? If the promised land is to diagnose, to deliver that specialized intervention, are we delivering? And we haven't examined that closely enough. And what we need to do is, okay, if you are diagnosed as having a disability, let's put aside any potential questions about misdiagnosis or misidentification. Let's assume they are there. Are these students, are these groups of students experiencing special education in the same way? Are they really getting the services and the supports? And two, do we see any changes? Is it making a difference in their lives, in their learning trajectories? We don't have enough evidence of that. There is some evidence calling into question that there might be indeed some bias. For example, there is some evidence showing that Black students are placed in more segregated programs from the general education system than their white peers with the same disability.
Right.
There is also evidence showing that white low-income students tend to be have less proclivity to be identified with disabilities than Black students that come from low-income backgrounds. There is evidence that second language learners, or what was called English language learners, now being called multilingual learners, tend to have a higher probability to be identified for this, having disability in schools that are more affluent, which in turn is interesting because these are contexts in which you have better qualified teachers, more funding, a greater diversity of resources. There is also research showing that Black students tend to receive fewer what is called related services. These are complementary services that enrich the educational programming around language, about occupational things, and so forth. And they receive fewer of those services than their white peers with the same label. And so there are questions that the experience of these students, once they enter this entire field, is not necessarily delivering or offering the opportunities that we are supposed to be providing here. That's one. The second thing is that the nature of the knowledge base that we have in inclusive education / special education in the US has been completely oblivious to issues of difference, specifically culture, race, and language. You look at samples of studies, the vast majority, and there have been major reviews of the literature over at least 20 years, examining very carefully what are the kinds of questions that are asked in those studies. What is the composition of the samples? How are data examined in terms of disaggregating data, looking at subgroups, looking at potential influence of certain dimensions of difference, like language and culture, etc. And the result has been that we have a very color neutral approach in knowledge production. And so if we are promising that these kids, black and brown kids, have greater needs, and we push them into a system that is completely oblivious by virtue of the interventions and the tools that we deploy to serve them, we're doing a major disservice to them. And we have that doesn't change overnight. I mean, it means changing doctoral preparation programs to prepare researchers to think what is the cultural nature of learning? How do we understand human development as a cultural project? Most people in the field, in special ed and psychology, don't know what to answer to that, or even in the medical field. So changing training is critical. Changing policies that require attention to these things is enormous. Promoting policies in school systems that call attention to this is important. We have some safeguards about this. In practice, they are not necessarily being acted. So this is a long-winded way of answering the huge complexity of your question.
It's fascinating to hear you talk like that. And yeah, I think, I was mentioning to you before we came on, I've done limited work on a kind of a disproportionality piece. The racial issue in Ireland isn't as present, perhaps, as in the United States. And the findings came out about an overrepresentation of students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, for want of a better terminology, placed in special education. Um, what I'm getting from you there, though, that's really kind of taking me aback, is the role of the researcher and the role of data in itself in perpetuating this difference and in not providing a holistic uh, exploration or examination of the impact of separate instruction or separate settings. Is
Right.
that fair?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. It's really interesting to hear you talk like that, and I know in your work you describe the justice paradox, and I'd love to bring you onto that now, if possible. Could you explain to listeners what that means, and why you have developed it in your research?
Yes, thank you for that question. As I grapple with all of these issues that we're discussing, I've been trying to make sense of it. And one of the important insights that I gained over time was that we have to think. Let me go back a minute in terms of the argument. The debates and the discussions in the field have been framed as if there is this one entity that is monolithic and unquestionable, which is disability. There is this one thing that is disability, and our job is to determine, do you have it or not? And are you biased or not? It's a very binary approach to understanding the human condition. And what we tend to forget is that sometimes concepts might become what sociologists of science call a boundary object. A boundary object that was coined by Lee Starr and Grissomer in the early 90s, late 80s, looking at the work of people doing analysis in museums and in the field to categorize and classify insects and plants and so forth. And how they created concepts in the field that then were used in the museum as they were developing taxonomies and developing displays of this in ways that really signal slightly different framings and conceptions of the same notion or idea. And so, in our case, disability might be used in a very specific way in the policy world that may change meaning and uses and applications in teacher education programs or in assessment rooms or in classrooms. And so, in that way, it's the same concept crossing different contexts, but it crosses the boundaries of teacher preparation and classroom instruction and policy, etc. And it's crossing those boundaries, but it's the same object that is changing very subtly the meaning and the implications of it. It maintains the same set of core elements in the definition, but it changes from this context to the next. And so, for example, one thing that we found in Guatemala, we did some research a few years ago, is that the idea of having a right to an inclusive education became a locally contested notion because disability, even though it was included in the national policy, was interpreted in very different ways at the local level by the principal that you were talking to. And so that person became the gatekeeper and interpreter of what disability meant and said,
Mhm.
well, this person can come in, even though the policy called for everybody to come in,
Mhm.
but this other cannot because the needs of this young child are too intense and we don't have the specialization to provide the resources. And for that reason, we need to place this student in a segregated place where there are the specialists, the hospital, the clinic, etc. So in that way, they maintain the rights framework intact, while at the same time they subverted the inclusive agenda by invoking rights. They have the right to get the right service there, not here. And so I think about this idea of disability as changing meaning across contexts over time. And for that reason, I think about disability as having a dual nature. Disability can be used to protect groups. And so we say you have a speech impairment, so we're going to give you services to help you correct that. Or you have an intellectual disability, and we're going to give you supports to learn to read and write, etc. And in that sense, we have a lot of really great resources around the world for that. It's done in the labor, it's done in education, it's done in health, etc. But we also have multiple instances of using the very same idea of disability to push out and to exclude and to stratify. And there, if you look at the history of disability, historians and sociologists have done a lot of this work showing that disability has been consistently connected to certain groups and markers over time: immigrants, racialized groups, low income people. And that designation of having a disability has been used to justify exclusion and push out of opportunities. So, in that sense, disability is both. It's something that we use to serve and safeguard, at the same time to marginalize. And so, when we develop a system like inclusive education or special education to provide services and protect these students, we might end up, and we do that in the name of equity, because these populations have been underserved, they have been discriminated for centuries. And so we do that, and that's a welcome advancement in every society to have those protections. And so we invoke justice to say, here is a system. But then we turn and see situations in which that very system that had origins in justice become a tool to push out and to marginalize. And when you see research on what is called now the second generation discrimination in schools, you see special education as one of the resources that is used to isolate and to segregate. Before, in the US, there were schools that were racially divided. There were schools for whites and schools for blacks. That was the first generation of discrimination. Now we have the second generation discrimination, which is isolation within the same building. And how is that done? Within systems that are created in that um, structure. In this case, special education is within the same building, but it's allocated to certain spaces that tend to be isolated from the rest of the life of the school. And so in that case, you create a paradox because the very tool that we came up with, special ed, inclusive ed, to address a justice need, is now creating a new injustice. And for that reason, I call it a paradox of equity.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I really think I feel like I need to. I haven't heard of the first generation, second generation idea, and I think that's a lovely way to kind of put it. But I think a lot of what we're talking about at local level is with it, as you said, it comes from the equity perspective. It's people with good meaning, with goodwill towards the education of the child.
Right,
But at a system level, it produces something very, very different, and particularly over time, right? When it becomes entrenched, and you use this lovely term of historical entanglements, which I just paused upon as well, just to describe just how much that drives current provision and attitudes
right.
towards this type of provision. Alfredo, we've touched on like the tip of the iceberg in terms of what your research has covered. Is there anything that you think listeners would like to hear, or would you like to probe further into? I was saying to you before we came on that I'm a undergraduate in historical geography, and I know that runs through some of your literature as well. But is there anything else you'd like to raise before we wrap things up?
Let me mention a couple of things quickly. One is the issue of space that you mentioned. We tend to, when you see the history of science, especially in the social sciences, an incredible amount of knowledge has been produced over centuries that privileges attention to time. We have documented things and how they evolve over time. History is king. We have made sure that we examine things over time, but we haven't done enough comparably with space unless we begin to see the last 50 years or so. You see an incredible systematic approach to account for space in the experiences of human beings in complex institutional settings. And so I think it's an important challenge for all of us studying issues of inclusive education to begin to learn more about how space shapes and matters. I'm not talking only about space in a physical sense. I'm talking about space as the space of the mind and the imagined spaces and the futures we imagine. Those are spaces, as well as the interpersonal social spaces we have every day in institutions. So it's a different way of thinking about space beyond the physical. The physical matters a great deal because it shapes access to resources and investments, but there are other dimensions of space that I want to mention. So that's one of the things. The other thing is that discussions of equity and inclusive education tend to be eventually circumscribed around people, what people do to others, even if they're just applying policies and rules. And that's important. There is bias and there are prejudiced people, but that's only half of the picture. We need to think about equity as something that is also embedded in assumptions, in policies, in rules that tend to be invisible in the everyday life of schools and communities. And so, if you think, for example, in the case of the United States, there has been a historical project to deal with difference in very problematic ways. When you have a society structured and advanced economically, socially, culturally around race in the way it was and has been and continues to be, you cannot ignore that fact. And then you have to ask, how is that played out today in this? And we have done recent work, for example, on racial disparities in schools in districts in which we went out to the community and asked not only the staff, but around people around the community, what is the history of this community around racial differences? And sure enough, we found very direct, robust connections between the history of racial tensions in the community, very much aligned with space, by the way, and where you live and where you come from as a marker of what kind of person you are, and how those filter down into the dynamic of school culture that in turn shaped racial disparities patterns in districts that were chronically cited for that disproportionality. And so I just want to call everyone to think about these issues beyond mere bad people acting in bad terms, that we need to look for the institutional dimension and the ideological dimension that are often invisible in the analysis we do because we are only looking for the bias of that person. If I don't find it, then there must be something wrong with the kid.
Mm-hmm. Alfredo, that was a fascinating discussion. I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. I'm going to put links to the literature that you sent me on the show notes so that listeners can access them that way. Is there anything else you'd like to point listeners to in terms of current research, or can they just Google you on the web? Is that okay?
Yes, please. And I appreciate again the opportunity. Please feel free to contact me. I don't know if they can have access to my email. I'll be happy to engage and learn from the work you're doing
Amazing.
in your own sites. And especially you, Joan, I think it's important to begin to exchange more across national boundaries about this work. So I look forward to that.
Absolutely. And I look forward to it too. Thank you very, very much.
Yes, thank you. Bye.